The dimensional convergence began 3 weeks later with reality itself, seeming to bend and twist around Jake Cabin. The barriers between worlds grew thin and strange lights danced across the sky as the Empire prepared to launch their invasion. Jake had used the time while Lyra Lee had helped him contact 7 other refugees who had made their way to his property. Each brought unique abilities and knowledge that strengthened their small resistance force. Among the refugees was Marcus, a former human soldier who had been fighting the Empire for 2 years after his dimension was conquered. He taught Jake advanced combat techniques that combined military tactics with dimensional warfare. There was also Vera, a scientist from a world that had successfully resisted one Empire invasion. She brought technological knowledge that helped them upgrade their weapons and defensive systems. The most surprising addition was Elena, a human woman from Chicago, who had awakened her dimensional abilities. When Empire agents tried to capture her, she had fought her way free and followed the energy signatures to find Jake Cabin. As the convergence reached its peak, massive rifts began tearing open in the sky above major cities around the world. The Empire invasion fleet poured through in overwhelming numbers. Their ships were the size of city blocks and bristled with weapons that could level mountains. But something the Empire had not expected began happening immediately. Every human touched by the dimensional energy streaming through the rifts started manifesting abilities they had never known they possessed. In New York City, office workers found they could create energy shields that stopped Empire weapons. In Los Angeles, police officers discovered they could phase through solid matter like the shadow wraiths. In Chicago, ordinary citizens began flying through the air using pure willpower. The Empire had planned for human resistance, but they had assumed it would be conventional warfare, with guns and explosives. Instead, they found themselves fighting opponents who could manipulate reality itself. Military bases that should have fallen within minutes held out for hours. As soldiers learned to amplify their weapons with dimensional energy, civilian populations that should have panicked instead organized into fighting units that used their new abilities with deadly effectiveness. At his cabin, Jake felt every human awakening across the planet through his connection to the dimensional network. Each new activation sent a pulse of energy through the global nexus, making all the defenders stronger. Lyra Lee was amazed by what she was seeing. She told Jake that in all her travels, she had never witnessed an entire species spontaneously developing dimensional abilities. The Empire invasion was actually triggering humanity evolution, but the Empire was not helpless. They began adapting their tactics and bringing through specialized units designed to fight dimensionally active opponents. The war was far from over. The first major assault on Jake's position came from a force of biomechanical hunters that had been specifically programmed to counter his abilities. They had studied his fighting patterns and developed countermeasures for every technique he had used. But Jake was no longer the same person who had stumbled onto Lyra Lee and Ember 3 months ago. His connection to the planetary consciousness had grown so strong that he could draw on the life force of entire forests. When the hunters attacked, Jake met them with power they could not have imagined. He turned their own adaptive abilities against them by constantly changing his energy patterns faster than they could analyze. Ember had also grown during the weeks of training. The young dragon was now large enough to carry a person, and his dimensional abilities had developed to near-adult levels. He could create stable portals between distant locations, and his flame could burn through any material the Empire possessed. Working together, Jake and Ember began striking back at the Empire forces. They used portal jumps to attack invasion ships directly appearing inside their shields and tearing them apart from within. Lyra Lee coordinated with resistance cells around the world. Using her advanced communications equipment, the refugee network had grown into a global organization that was feeding intelligence and support to human military forces. The turning point came when Jake realized they did not have to just defend against the invasion. They could turn the Empire's own weapons against them. Every dimensional rift the invaders opened was a potential gateway that could be redirected. Using techniques that Ember taught him, Jake began seizing control of the Empire portal network. Instead of allowing troops to pour through into Earth, he started redirecting the rifts to send the invasion fleets into black holes and stellar furnaces. The Empire commanders were shocked to see their own dimensional technology being used against them with a skill level that exceeded their best operators. They had never encountered beings who could manipulate rifts so precisely. As the tide of battle began to turn, Jake made a decision that would change the course of the war. Instead of simply repelling the invasion, he would send a message to every dimension under Empire control. Working with Ember and drawing on the full power of Earth dimensional nexus, Jake opened a communication channel that reached across multiple realities. He spoke directly to every enslaved world in the Empire territory. His message was simple but powerful. Humanity would not submit to conquest, and they would help any world that wanted to throw off Empire rule. Earth dimensional technology was available to any species willing to fight for their freedom. The response was immediate. Rebellions erupted across dozens of conquered worlds as enslaved species realized they were not alone. The Empire suddenly found itself fighting wars on multiple fronts as their victims turned against them. Several Empire commanders tried to negotiate, but Jake's rejection was absolute. There would be no compromise with beings who enslaved entire worlds. The Empire had to be completely destroyed, or they would simply rebuild and try again. The final battle took place not on Earth but in the Empire home dimension. Jake led a strike force through a captured portal network to attack the Emperor throne world directly. The Emperor himself was an ancient being that had consumed the life force of billions of sentient creatures over thousands of years. He was incredibly powerful, but he had made one fatal mistake in attacking Earth. Jake's connection to the planetary consciousness had grown so strong that he carried a fragment of Earth itself within his dimensional matrix. When he confronted the Emperor, the planet fought alongside him. The battle raged across multiple dimensions as reality itself became a weapon. Jake used the Emperor's own consumption of life force against him, channeling the pain and rage of every world the Empire had destroyed. In the end, it was Ember who delivered the killing blow. The young dragon had reached full maturity during the fighting, and his power to seal dimensional rifts had grown beyond anything the Empire could counter. Ember trapped the Emperor in a collapsing pocket dimension that would compress into nothingness over the course of several thousand years. The Empire leader would have plenty of time to contemplate his crimes before the end came. With their Emperor gone and their fleet scattered, the Empire forces surrendered or fled to distant dimensions. The war was over, but Jake knew his work was just beginning. Earth had become the center of a new alliance of free worlds committed to preventing another empire from rising. Jake Cabin was converted into the first embassy between dimensions, with Lyra serving as Earth, first interdimensional ambassador. Ember took on the role of guardian, traveling between worlds to help other species develop their own dimensional defenses. He had grown from a helpless refugee into one of the most powerful beings in known reality. Jake himself became something unprecedented, a human who served as an anchor point for the stability of multiple dimensions. His connection to Earth consciousness allowed him to monitor threats across vast distances. The quiet mountain cabin that had once been his refuge from the world became the headquarters for an organization dedicated to protecting all worlds from interdimensional tyranny. Jake often stood on his porch in the evenings watching the lights of friendly ships moving between dimensions through the permanent portal network that now connected dozens of free worlds. Thought about how much his life had changed since that first night, when he had discovered strange symbols carved in his door. Sometimes he missed the simple peace of his old retirement, but he would not trade his new purpose for anything. Humanity had proven that they were not just another species to be conquered. They were the guardians of reality itself, and any force that threatened peaceful worlds would face the full wrath of Earth. Dimensional anchors. The war that had started with one Marine veteran trying to help a refugee and her dragon companion had ended with humanity taking its place as protectors of the galaxy. And it all began because Jake Morrison had been willing to step out of the shadows and offer his help to someone in need. Jake training began before dawn the next morning. Lyra woke him by placing her glowing hand on his forehead, and suddenly he could see things that had been invisible before. Streams of golden energy flowed through everything around him, connecting all living things in a vast web of power. She taught him to feel the dimensional currents that ran beneath the surface of reality. Jake learned to sense when the barriers between worlds grew thin and how to strengthen them with his own energy. The training was exhausting but also exhilarating. Ember helped with the lessons in ways Jake had not expected. The young dragon could show him how energy moved by changing the colors of his scales. When Jake did something correctly, Ember scales would shift to bright gold. When he made mistakes, they turned deep red. After 3 days of intensive training, Jake could create basic energy shields and sense threats from other dimensions. He was still clumsy with his new abilities, but Lyrelay said he was learning faster than anyone she had ever taught. On the 4th morning, their peaceful training came to an abrupt end. Jake woke to find Ember pacing nervously around the cabin, his scales flickering between black and silver. Lyrelay stood at the window scanning the forest with obvious concern. She told Jake that something was wrong. The dimensional barriers around his property were being probed by hostile forces. The Empire had finally located them, and scouts were testing their defenses. Jake asked what kind of scouts they were dealing with. Lyrelay said the Empire used 3 types of advanced forces for reconnaissance missions. Each one was specially designed to hunt specific types of enemies. The first were shadow wraiths, beings that existed partially outside normal reality. They could phase through solid matter and were nearly invisible to most detection methods. The wraiths fed on fear and despair, and could drive their targets insane before moving in for the kill a second. Type were energy vampires that appeared as beautiful humanoids but could drain the life force from any living thing they touched. They were incredibly fast and strong, and they became more powerful with each victim they claimed. The third and most dangerous were biomechanical hunters that could adapt to any environment or opponent. They analyzed their targets' weaknesses and modified their own bodies to exploit those vulnerabilities. Lyrelay said the probing patterns suggested all 3 types were circling the property. They were probably waiting for orders or for Jake defenses to weaken before launching their attack. Jake felt his old military instincts take over. He asked Lyrelay about the capabilities and weaknesses of each enemy type. Then he began planning defensive strategies using both conventional weapons and his new dimensional abilities. He spent the morning setting up overlapping fields of fire around his cabin, using hunting rifles and shotguns positioned at strategic points. Lyrelay provided him with dimensional amplifiers that would make his conventional weapons effective against interdimensional enemies. Jake also created a series of energy traps using techniques Lyrelay had taught him. He learned to weave dimensional barriers into nearly invisible nets that would snare anything trying to phase through solid matter. Ember proved surprisingly helpful with the defensive preparations. The young dragon could sense the exact locations of the enemy scouts and guide Jake's positioning of weapons and traps. His scales provided a constant update on threat levels. As evening approached, the attacks began. The shadow wraiths came first, sliding through the walls of the cabin like smoke given form. Their touch was freezing cold, and they whispered terrible things in languages that predated human civilization, but Jake was ready for them. His energy shields held firm against their attacks, and the dimensional traps Lyrelay had helped him create caught several wraiths before they could escape back into the shadow realm. The energy vampires attacked next, moving so fast they appeared as streaks of light between the trees. They tried to drain Jake's life force from a distance, but his connection to the Nexus point made him too powerful for them to affect. Jake used his hunting rifle loaded with dimensionally charged ammunition to pick off the vampires one by one. Each shot blazed with golden energy, and the creatures screamed as they dissolved back into their component energies. The biomechanical hunters were the most challenging opponents. They studied Jake's defensive patterns and began adapting their attacks accordingly. One hunter developed armor plating that deflected his rifle shots, while another grew wings to attack from above. But Jake had advantages the hunters had not expected. His military training included tactics for fighting adaptive enemies, and his dimensional abilities let him sense their modifications before they were complete working. Together, Jake and Lyrelay managed to destroy or drive off all the scouts, but they knew this was just the beginning. The Empire now knew exactly where they were, and would send much stronger forces for the next attack. During a brief lull in the fighting, Lyrelay told Jake about the other refugees she had been trying to contact. Several had gone silent in recent days, which suggested the Empire was hunting them down systematically. She said they needed to reach the surviving refugees quickly and bring them to defensible positions before the Empire could eliminate them all. Jake suggested using his cabin as a rallying point, since they had already proven it could be defended. Lyra Lay agreed, but warned that gathering so many powerful beings in one place would create a dimensional beacon that the Empire could not ignore. They would have to be ready for a massive assault. Once the other refugees arrived, Jake asked about human allies. Lyra Lay said she had identified several humans with strong, dimensional abilities, but most of them did not know about their powers. She could train them quickly, but they would need time to adjust to their new reality. Time was something they did not have. The dimensional convergence was only weeks away, and the Empire would launch their full invasion as soon as the barriers weakened. They needed to gather their forces and prepare for the final battle as they discussed their plans. Jake noticed that the local wildlife was behaving strangely. Bears and wolves that should have fled from the fighting were instead moving closer to his property. They seemed drawn to the dimensional energy. Even smaller animals like squirrels and rabbits were acting differently. They moved in coordinated groups and appeared to be watching for threats. Jake mentioned this to Lyra Lee, and her eyes widened with surprise. She said she had never seen anything like it before. Usually animals avoided areas of intense dimensional activity, but the creatures around Jake's property seemed to be offering their protection. Lyra Lee suggested that Jake's connection to the Nexus was so strong that it was affecting the entire local ecosystem. The planet itself might be recognizing the threat and mobilizing its defenses. This gave Jake an idea. He asked if he could extend his influence beyond just the animals. Lyra Lee said it was theoretically possible for a powerful anchor to connect with planetary consciousness, but no human had ever attempted such a thing. Jake decided to try. He sat in meditation and reached out with his dimensional senses, trying to touch the vast network of energy that connected all life on Earth. The effort was exhausting, but gradually he began to feel a response. Something ancient and patient stirred in the depths of the planet. It had been waiting for countless ages for one of the surface dwellers to make contact. Jake felt its recognition and its willingness to help defend against the invasion. When Jake opened his eyes, he found that his connection to the Nexus had grown exponentially stronger. He could sense dimensional activity anywhere on the continent, and his energy shields were now powerful enough to protect much larger areas. Lyra Lee stared at him in amazement. She said he had just accomplished something that even her people considered impossible. He had awakened Earth defensive systems and given them conscious direction. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on him again, but this time it came with a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. He was no longer just fighting to protect his friends, but to defend an entire world as night fell. They prepared for the next wave of attacks. But now Jake had allies he had never imagined. The forest itself would fight alongside them, and the planet would lend its strength to their cause. The Empire had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed Earth would be helpless against interdimensional invasion. But they had not counted on humanity's natural connection to their world, or the fierce protective instincts that connection could unleash. Jake looked at Lyra Lee and Ember and smiled grimly. The real war was about to begin. But for the first time since this all started, he believed they might actually have a chance to win. Lyra Lee returned the next evening as promised, but this time she brought Ember openly into Jake's cabin. The young dragon had recovered enough to fly short distances, and his scales now shimmered with healthy color. Jake felt proud that his strange, healing ability had helped save the creature. Lyra Lee sat across from Jake at his kitchen table while Ember curled up on the couch like an oversized cat. The dragon seemed to enjoy the warmth from the fireplace and made soft purring sounds that filled the cabin with contentment. Jake had spent the day thinking about everything Lyra Lee had told him. He had dozens of questions, but he started with the most important one. He asked her to explain exactly what the Empire of Vorthak wanted, and why they were so dangerous. Lyra Lee's expression grew serious. She explained that the Vorthak Empire had existed for thousands of years, conquering dimension after dimension. They were not a single species, but a collection of conquered races forced to serve an emperor who fed on the life force of entire worlds. She said the Empire had perfected the art of dimensional warfare. They would open portals into peaceful worlds and pour through with overwhelming force. Most species had no defense against attacks that came from outside their reality. The Empire had a simple strategy. They would capture the most powerful beings from each world and force them to serve as weapons against the next target. Any species that resisted was completely destroyed. As an example to others, Jake asked why Earth was different. Lyrelay stood up and walked to the window. She pointed out at the forest and said that every tree, every rock, every living thing on this planet was connected to a vast network of dimensional energy. She explained that Earth was not just a nexus point, but the primary nexus for this entire cluster of realities. The planet served as an anchor that kept dozens of dimensions stable and separate. If the Empire gained control of Earth, they could reshape reality itself. Lyrelay returned to her chair and continued her explanation. She said humans were unique because they had evolved in direct contact with dimensional energy. Most species developed on worlds that were isolated from these forces, but Earth was different. She told Jake that every human carried dimensional energy in their cells like a natural battery. This energy made them incredibly adaptable and surprisingly difficult to kill or control. The Empire had tried to conquer human-dominated worlds before and failed every time. Jake asked why they kept trying if humans were so dangerous. Lyrelay smiled grimly and said that was exactly why they had to succeed. If humans ever learned to use their dimensional abilities consciously, they could become unstoppable. She explained that the Empire plan was to invade Earth before humans developed dimensional technology. They wanted to capture and enslave humanity. While they were still unaware of their true potential, Lyrelay told Jake about the intelligence she had gathered before fleeing her homeworld. The Empire had spent decades placing sleeper agents in Earth governments and military organizations. They had been studying human behavior and looking for weaknesses, she said. The invasion fleet was already gathering in a staging dimension just beyond the barriers around Earth. The Empire was waiting for the right moment to strike, when human defenses would be at their weakest. Jake asked about Ember's role in all this. Lyrelay looked over at the young dragon with obvious affection. She explained that starfire dragons were the only beings capable of permanently sealing dimensional rifts. If Ember reached maturity, he could cut off the Empire access to Earth entirely. Said that was why the Empire was so desperate to capture him. A fully grown starfire dragon could trap their entire invasion fleet in the staging dimension forever. But Ember was still young and his powers were not fully developed. Jake asked how long they had before the invasion. Lyrelay said her sources suggested the Empire would move within the next few months. They were waiting for something called a dimensional convergence, when the barriers between realities would be at their thinnest. Explained that during convergence, the Empire would need less energy to open large portals. This would allow them to bring through their biggest ships and most powerful weapons. All previous attempts to invade Earth had failed because they could only send small forces. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He asked what they could do to stop an entire interdimensional empire with just the three of them. Lyrelay said they were not completely alone. She told him about other refugees scattered across Earth, beings from conquered worlds who had escaped the Empire and were hiding on the planet. Many of them had abilities that could help in the coming fight. Lyrelay also explained that Jake was not the only human with strong dimensional abilities. The energy was stronger in some people than others, and those individuals could be trained to use their powers consciously. She said her plan was to find and gather these special humans and refugees to form a resistance force. They would have to work in secret because the Empire agents would try to stop them. Jake asked what his role would be in this resistance. Lyrelay looked at him seriously and said his cabin sat on one of the most powerful nexus points on the planet. With the right preparations, it could become a fortress that even the Empire would struggle to breach. She explained that Jake's natural abilities combined with the nexus energy made him incredibly important to their cause. He could anchor dimensional barriers and enhance the powers of everyone around him. Lyrelay also said that Ember had bonded with Jake in a way that was extremely rare. Starfire dragons usually only bonded with members of their own species, but Ember had connected with Jake. Dimensional energy. This bond meant that Jake could help accelerate Ember development and protect him while his powers grew. Together, they might be able to seal the dimensional rifts even before Ember reached full maturity. Jake asked what training he would need. Lirelai said she could teach him to see and manipulate dimensional energy consciously. Most humans use these abilities instinctively, but Jake could learn to control them deliberately. She warned him that the training would be difficult and potentially dangerous. Working with dimensional energy required intense focus and mental discipline. One mistake could tear holes in reality or damage his connection to the Nexus. Jake said he was willing to take the risk. He had made harder choices in the military, and the stakes had never been this high. Lirelai smiled and said she had hoped he would agree. She told him they would start training immediately. Every day they delayed gave the Empire more time to prepare their invasion. They needed to build their defenses and gather their allies as quickly as possible. Lirelai also warned Jake that once they began actively using dimensional energy, the Empire agents on Earth would start looking for them. They would have to be careful and ready to defend themselves at all times. Jake asked about weapons and equipment. Lirelai said she had hidden supplies in several locations around the world. Advanced technology from her home world that could level the playing field against Empire forces. He explained that these weapons were powered by dimensional energy and could only be used by beings with the right abilities. Jake's natural talents meant he could use almost any of her people equipment. As the night wore on, Lirelai outlined their immediate plans. They would begin Jake training while also reaching out to other refugees and potential allies. They needed to move fast but also stay hidden from Empire surveillance. Jake felt a mixture of excitement and fear as he realized how much his life was about to change. A week ago, his biggest worry had been paying his property taxes. Now he was preparing to fight an interdimensional war, but as he looked at Lirelai and Ember, he knew he had made the right choice. These beings had trusted him with their lives and their cause. He would not let them down. The war for Earth was about to begin, and Jake Morrison was going to be right in the middle of it. Jake spent the entire next day preparing for whatever would come that night. He used his military training to set up hidden observation points around his property. He wanted to see his mysterious visitors without being seen himself. He chose a spot 30 yards from his cabin where thick pine trees would hide him, but still give him a clear view of the clearing. Jake brought his rifle binoculars and enough food and water to last through the night. He covered himself with a camouflage tarp and settled into wait. As the sun went down, Jake heard the musical singing start again, but this time it sounded different. The voice carried notes of sadness and pain that made his chest feel tight. Something was wrong, and whoever was singing was in distress. Around midnight, a figure emerged from the forest, and Jake nearly dropped his binoculars. The being that walked into his clearing was unlike anything he had ever seen. She stood nearly 7 feet tall with a graceful build that seemed too delicate to be real. Her skin glowed with a soft silver light that made her easy to see in the darkness. Long pointed ears swept back from her head, and her hair flowed like liquid mercury down to her waist. Her clothes looked like they were woven from starlight, and they moved around her like they were alive. But what really caught Jake's attention was what she carried in her arms. A small creature about the size of a house cat lay limp against her chest. The creature had scales that shifted, color from deep blue to bright gold, and tiny wings that hung motionless at its sides. The woman knelt by the burned circle closest to Jake's hiding spot and gently placed the small creature on the ground. She began to speak in that musical language Jake had heard before, but now her words were clearly full of worry and fear. Light began to flow from the woman's hands as she held them over the injured creature. The light was warm and golden, and it made the air around them shimmer like heat waves. Jake watched in amazement as the woman tried to heal whatever was wrong with the small being. The creature stirred and made a sound that was part birdsong and part cat purr, but then it cried out in obvious pain. The sound cut through Jake like a knife. He had heard too many injured soldiers make similar sounds, and his instincts took over before his brain could stop him. Jake stood up and stepped out from behind the trees. The woman spun around faster than any human could move. Her eyes, blazed with protective fury and power, crackled around her hands like lightning. Jake found himself staring at someone who could end his life without breaking a sweat, but instead of attacking the woman, froze completely. Her glowing eyes widened, and She stared at Jake's face like she was seeing a ghost. Her hands shook and the power around them flickered and died. She said something in her musical language that sounded like a question. Jake raised his hands to show he was not armed. He took a slow step forward and spoke as gently as he could manage. He told her he was not there to hurt her or the small creature. He said he wanted to help if he could. The woman studied his face for a long moment, then looked down at the injured creature in her arms. She seemed to be weighing her options. Jake could see the conflict in her expression. She needed help, but she was not sure if she could trust him. The small creature cried out again, and the woman's decision was made. She looked back at Jake and spoke in heavily accented English. Her voice was like wind chimes and flowing water even when speaking his language. She asked if he knew anything about healing. Jake knelt down slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. He told her he had some medical training from the military and he had supplies in his cabin that might help. He asked what was wrong with the creature. The woman explained that her companion had been poisoned by something called shadow essence. She said it was a weapon used by her enemies and that normal healing methods would not work. The poison was slowly draining the creature's life force. Jake asked if he could take a closer look. The woman hesitated, then carefully passed the small creature to him. Jake had never held anything so delicate. The creature was surprisingly warm and its scales felt like silk under his fingers. As soon as Jake touched the creature, something strange happened. A warm, tingling sensation ran up his arms and the creature's eyes opened. They were bright gold and ancient-looking, far too old for something so small. The creature made a soft trilling sound and some of its pain seemed to ease. The woman gasped and stared at Jake. Hands. A faint, golden glow surrounded his fingers where he touched the creature. She spoke rapidly in her own language, then switched back to English. She said she had never seen a human do that before. Jake asked what he was doing. The woman explained that he was sharing his life force with her companion, something that should have been impossible for his species. She said humans were not supposed to be able to manipulate dimensional energy. The creature, which the woman called Ember, began to recover slowly. The golden glow from Jake's hands grew stronger, and the poison seemed to weaken. Ember's scales regained their color. Shifting ability and his tiny wings began to flutter. The woman introduced herself as Lyrelay. She said she was from a place called the Celestial Dominion of Ethermoor. She explained that Ember was not just a pet, but a member of an ancient and powerful species called starfire dragons. Jake asked why they were hiding in his cabin. Lyralay's expression grew dark. She said they were refugees running from an evil empire that wanted to capture Ember and use his abilities for conquest. She had been searching for a safe place to hide when she found his empty cabin. She said she had not expected him to return so soon, and she apologized for using his home without permission. Jake told her it was fine and asked what made his cabin a safe place. Lyrelay smiled sadly and said his property sat on what her people called a dimensional nexus point. She explained that Earth was more special than humans realized. It was a crossing point between different realities and dimensions. The energy that flowed through these nexus points could hide them from their enemies, but it also made the planet incredibly valuable. Jake asked why their enemies wanted Ember. Lyrelay held the young dragon close and explained that starfire dragons could travel between dimensions and manipulate the barriers between realities. In the wrong hands, these abilities could be used to conquer entire worlds. She said the Empire of Vorthak had been hunting her people for generations, trying to capture and enslave the dragons. They had already destroyed most of the free worlds in several dimensions, and now they were preparing to invade Earth. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He asked why they would want to invade Earth. Lyrelay looked at him with an expression of surprise. She said humans were natural dimensional anchors capable of stabilizing reality itself, that made them both incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous to interdimensional conquerors. She explained that most species could only exist in their home dimension, but humans could survive and even thrive in multiple realities. This ability combined with their natural aggression and adaptability made them a serious threat. To any empire that relied on dimensional manipulation, Jake processed this information slowly. He asked if that was why he could help heal Ember. Lyreley nodded and said his connection to Earth dimensional energy made him far more powerful than he realized. She said he might be one of the strongest anchors she had ever encountered. As dawn approached, Lyreley prepared to leave with Ember. She said it was not safe for them to stay in one place too long. Jake surprised himself by asking her to stay. He said his cabin was isolated and defensible and he could help protect them. Lyreley looked at him with gratitude and hope in her glowing eyes. She said she would consider his offer, but first she needed to know if he truly understood what he was offering. The Empire of Vorthak would eventually find them, and when they did, the battle would be fierce and deadly. Jake told her he had spent enough years fighting wars for causes he did not fully believe in. Now he had a chance to fight for something that really mattered. He would help her protect Ember and find a way to stop the Empire from conquering. Earth Lyreley smiled, and it was like watching the sunrise. She said she would return the next night to give him her answer. As she disappeared into the forest with Ember, Jake realized his quiet retirement was over, and his most important mission was just beginning. Jake Morrison drove his old truck up the winding mountain road toward his cabin. The 3-month absence felt longer than usual, but the military contract work had paid well enough to keep the place running. He needed the peace and quiet that only the mountains could give him after too many years of war zones and crowded cities. The truck engine coughed as it climbed the steep grade, but it held together like it always did. Jake had bought the cabin 5 years ago when he left the Marines. It sat on 40 acres of pine forest with no neighbors for miles. The nearest town was 2 hours away down twisting roads that most people avoided. When Jake rounded the final bend, he expected to see his simple log cabin exactly as he had left it. Instead, something felt wrong. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, but there were shapes that did not belong. Strange symbols had been carved deep into the wooden doorframe. The marks looked fresh, and they definitely had not been there when he left. Jake parked the truck and stepped out slowly. His military training kicked in automatically. He scanned the area for threats but saw only trees and rocks. Everything looked normal except for those symbols. They were not random scratches someone had carved, them with purpose and skill. The front door was still locked, but Jake noticed the lock had been tampered with. Tiny scratches around the keyhole showed someone had worked on it. Jake pulled out his key and opened the door carefully. He stepped inside and immediately knew someone had been living in his cabin. The air smelled different. Not bad but strange, like flowers he had never encountered before. His pantry was full of foods he had never bought. Strange fruits and vegetables filled the shelves, along with containers holding liquids that glowed softly in the dim light. Jake had left the pantry nearly empty, but now it overflowed with supplies. His furniture had been moved. The couch faced a different direction, and someone had arranged the chairs in a circle around the fireplace. Books that Jake had never seen before sat on his table. Their covers showed symbols similar to the ones carved in his doorframe. Jake checked every room in the cabin. His bedroom showed signs of use, but not by anyone human. The bed had been slept in, but strange silver hairs clung to his pillow. The hairs felt softer than silk, and they seemed to glow with their own light in the bathroom. Jake found more evidence. Someone had used his shower and left behind bottles of soap that smelled like pine forests and morning rain. The mirror showed fingerprints that were longer and more delicate than human hands could make. As evening approached, Jake decided to stay and watch. He had camping gear in his truck, and he could set up outside if needed. But first he wanted to see what happened when darkness fell. He built a fire in the fireplace using normal wood and settled into his chair to wait. When full darkness came, the fire began to change. The orange flames slowly turned blue, and they burned without consuming any wood. Jake stood up and backed away from the fireplace. The blue flames danced and moved like they were alive. They cast strange shadows on the walls that looked like figures dancing. Sound came from outside the cabin. It was not quite singing and not quite speaking, but it had a musical quality that made Jake feel calm and worried at the same time. The voice sounded female, and the language was nothing Jake had ever heard before. The words flowed like water over rocks. Jake moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. The forest was completely black except for small points of light that moved between the trees. The lights pulsed in rhythm with the strange singing. They were too bright to be fireflies, and they moved with too much purpose. Something large crashed through the trees far from the cabin. Jake heard wood splintering and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. The singing stopped immediately, and the lights in the forest went out. The blue flames in his fireplace returned to normal orange. Jake spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, with his hunting rifle across his knees. He did not sleep, but nothing else happened. The forest remained quiet until dawn. When morning light filled the cabin, Jake went outside to investigate. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about the world. Giant claw marks had been gouged deep into the bark of the pine trees. Around his cabin, the marks were too big to come from any bear or mountain lion Jake had ever seen. They looked like they came from something with claws, as long as his forearm. Perfect circles of burned grass dotted the clearing around his cabin. The burns were not random. They formed a pattern that Jake could not understand, but that clearly had meaning. The grass inside each circle was completely gone, leaving only black earth behind. Jake followed a trail of unusual footprints leading away from his cabin. The prints were human-shaped but longer and narrower than any person Jake knew could make. They pressed deep into the soft earth, showing that whoever made them was surprisingly heavy, despite their delicate appearance. The trail led to a large oak tree at the edge of his property. Something had made a shelter in the hollow at the base of the tree. Jake found more of the strange foods and several pieces of cloth that felt like nothing he had ever touched. The material was stronger than steel but softer than cotton is. Jake examined the shelter. He heard a sound from above. A low rumbling growl came from the branches overhead. Jake looked up and saw two glowing eyes staring down at him. The eyes were larger than any animal he knew, and they burned with an inner fire that was definitely not natural. The eyes watched him for several long seconds, then disappeared into the thick canopy. Jake heard the sound of large wings beating, but he could not see what flew away. The branches above him were too thick, and the creature moved too quickly. Jake returned to his cabin with more questions than answers. Someone or something had been living on his property for weeks or maybe months. They had abilities that no human possessed, and they commanded creatures that should not exist. That night, Jake prepared for another vigil. He cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. He set up motion sensors around the cabin and prepared several different escape routes. But deep down, he knew that if these beings wanted to hurt him, they already would have. The real question was what they wanted and why they had chosen his cabin as their hiding place. Jake had a feeling that before this was over, he would learn answers to questions he had never thought to ask. The blue flames returned to his fireplace as darkness fell, and the musical voice began to sing again in the forest. But this time Jake was ready to find out who was making those sounds and what they wanted from him.